The Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship presents Don't Quill the Messenger, exploring the truth of Shakespearean authorship. I'm your host, Stephen Sable. Let's go ask some questions. Welcome back. We're so glad that you're still with us here today for the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship Shakespeare Authorship Symposium. Here I have next to me my favorite podcast guest, Dr. Earl Showerman. He is the most common guest on the Don't Quill the Messenger podcast series. And you saw just before we came back, there it is. There's our graphic. Don'tQuillThePodcast.com. Don'tQuillThePodcast.com is where you can find more than 40 different episodes of the podcast series. And as I mentioned, Earl is the most frequent recurring guest. And here he is today, sitting side by side with me the way we often have, and I'm sure again will in the future. I keep encouraging Earl that we need to do a podcast episode on Titus Andronicus. And I think finally, if you listened to the last episode where Ben August and I talked about the Oxford Herodotus volume that Ben has and how Herodotus was such a source for Titus, I think maybe finally we've maybe pushed Earl just enough to...
I say he shamed me into starting the research on Titus and Herodotus, and there is material there. In just a simple Google search, I found more than I needed, so... You will see me. Stephen and I live close to each other, so that's my great advantage over other members of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship group of scholars and speakers. That he lives just down the road from me a bit, so I do have a geographical advantage in that respect.
That is true. You're right.
But before we get into our own podcast series, I just want to say thank you to Catherine Chilgen for her amazing research on The Tempest and combining all the research that other Oxfordians have done on this question as well. Her book, Shakespeare Suppressed, is a mandatory read for all of you out there. It is a fantastic look at the historical elements that surround the whole Shakespeare authorship question. And one of my favorite things about her book, which she cited several pieces of, is her Too Early Allusions appendix to that book. I think she has done more detective work looking into the early dating of Shakespeare's plays based on allusions and other literary references. That is it's a wonderful excursion. And whenever I look through that, I always find another piece of magic in there. So thank you, Catherine, for your wonderful presentation today. And also, I would encourage you all to look into Shakespeare Suppressed. It's a wonderful book and really gives you so much more information than I can possibly convey in a few minutes here.
Indeed. And, we're going to talk a little bit along those lines right now as we sort of do this pretend podcast recording here as part of our lineup. If you've been paying attention to today's schedule, then you know that according to the schedule, we were supposed to welcome Ramon Jimenez today during this segment of the program. Unfortunately, Ramon suffered a loss in his family and could not be here today. But we are going to talk about some of his wonderful research and some of the things that he has brought to light over the years, including his magnificent book, Shakespeare's Apprenticeship, which is something that as a theater artist, I definitely cleave to, Earl, because I believe that many of the references, and that ties back to what you're talking about with Catherine's research, many of the early references to some of these plays with slightly different titles that we don't have access to or we can't find anymore, I believe may have been and most likely were original drafts or rough manuscript copies of some of the plays that we do have today. And if you know anything about the process that playwrights go through, or especially I love to use the example of Broadway musicals. Right. So the most famous and most popular Broadway musical right now would be Hamilton.
Right.
And if you were to talk to the creators of Hamilton, I'm sure they would tell you that that production went through a series of versions as it prepared to eventually be performed on Broadway. And even after opening on Broadway, there were some changes made before it became a national tour and went on to touring company greatness, where now, well, not currently, but previous to COVID conditions, where people would wait in line overnight or spend as much as thousands of dollars for a ticket to see that show.
Right. Well, the question of whether Shakespeare revised his plays has been more or less resolved. I mean, if you look at the two quartos of Hamlet that were published but 1 year apart, you see a dramatic difference between the first quarto, which is basically half the length of the second quarto, and the folio edition. And there are a number of other published quartos that have significant textual differences from what ends up in the first folio published in 1623. So there's no question that Shakespeare did go back and revise his works. And so Ramon's argument in Shakespeare's Apprenticeship is that these 5 apocryphal plays that were published anonymously, mostly in the 1590s, and we're talking about the famous victories of King Henry V, the true tragedy of Richard III, the troublesome reign of King John, Taming of a Shrew, and the Chronicle History of King Lear were all early renditions of what became Shakespeare's great histories and tragedies and comedy that were later published and under the pseudonym Shakespeare. And Ramon's book, Shakespeare's Apprenticeship, goes into great detail in his historically significant and unique textual comparisons and plot comparisons and characterization comparisons. Ramon is a remarkable historian, and I'm so glad to be here to praise Ramon Jimenez, the Oxfordian of the Year that he shared with his wife, Joan Leon, in 2018, because he has been at this for over 20 years. And so this is the summation of much of the work that he had done earlier in his career, and then combined that into a wonderful collection of arguments that point out the likelihood that these anonymous plays that were performed by the Queen's Men, and yesterday I talked about the importance of the Queen's Men as promoting the Tudor legitimacy. This is what Peter Lake was talking about in his book on Shakespeare, how Shakespeare put politics back on the stage. So there's no question that there was a link between those early apocryphal plays that were published anonymously and Shakespeare's definitive canon. So I think that's what...
Absolutely. And I think as you referenced some of Catherine's work, what we find is that there are references to performances of plays that predate what we know to be the current versions of the Shakespeare plays. And too bad we don't have more of those. And hopefully additional research will find more references in journals or notes or letters that people wrote about having seen this performance of the Queen's Men, or having seen this play at the Rose or at the Globe or wherever these plays might have been performed. Some of them, of course, court performances that are referenced by courtiers of the time who saw them as a special command performance for only the nobility, which I happen to believe is where many of these plays first began.
Now this is where Steve and I can disagree a little bit. Richard Dutton's book, Shakespeare Court Dramatist, published 3 or 4 years ago, argues conversely that the original versions of Shakespeare's plays were cut down to be performed in the public theaters, and that when the Lord Chamberlain's men or the King's men were given a commission to come to court with a play, that then he would do some revision on that play to expand it, because the court plays, the ones that were performed at court, could go on for 3 or 4 or long hours or longer. So you would have perhaps a complete Hamlet produced in a court production. That he argued that because of the ambiance of the court, where people were seated, it was in the evening, there were other considerations. He argues coherently, I think, that Shakespeare revised these plays and expanded them and added the classical allusions or some of the other subplot materials that you find in the final versions that were eventually published. Abraham Lincoln argued that Shakespeare's comedies were best appreciated on the stage, but that his tragedies were best appreciated as read as literature.
Well, and we know that Lincoln was very well known for reciting chunks of Shakespeare to his cabinet members, sometimes holding them captive almost after meetings that he would have with them to say, oh, wait, hold on, I want to present this piece to you. And of course, everybody knows that, ironically, Macbeth was one of his favorite plays. Yeah. So there you go. Well, I would say, having produced Macbeth a couple of times, including on a grand 140-foot proscenium for an audience that could house 3,800 people, as well as in a small black box theater for an audience that could only house 50 people, I think the impact of that play in that closer, more intimate setting is unquestionable as compared to the grand proscenium setting because of the the frightfully dramatic moments in the production. So interesting to consider whether these were originally created to present on a grand scale to an audience 3 stories high, or whether they were originally created to present to a court in, say, somebody's grand hall of their castle,
or a cockpit, which is the reference to the production of Henry V. In Ramon's article published several years ago on Henry V, and points out that the cockpit was actually a pit that was once at Whitehall Palace, that was converted by Inigo Jones into an actual theater, a small theater that had multiple tiers, but it was originally known as a cockpit, and it was later torn down, and that is now where 10 Downing Street is located these days. So when the chorus talks about in this cockpit, he's referring perhaps literally to the place where the play is being produced at court during a certain time in the early 1590s. But I wanted to kind of jump into Ramon's topic that we had asked him to speak about at this time, which is the 10 eyewitnesses in Stratford, London, who saw nothing. And that is the title of his talk. Now, the content of his presentation today can be found in a chapter in this book, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, which is now available on Amazon, and it's highly recommended. Ramon also has a critique of stylometrics in this volume, which is also very worthwhile reading, since stylometrics happens to be a very hot issue in Shakespeare studies these days, because Oxford University Press has used those techniques to expand the co-authorship of Shakespeare's plays from a handful to like 11 different plays by 18 different co-contributors it's outrageous, and they're using stylometric criteria, which Ramon critiques very well in this book. But in this book is the 10 Eyewitnesses essay. So I do recommend you get that. But those essays are available, previously published, and available on the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website under publications. The first of these essays was published in the fall of 2002. So go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website, click on Publications, Shakespeare Oxford Newsletter, and go to the fall issue of 2002. And that's where he covers 5 of these 10 eyewitnesses. That's volume 38. And then a few years later, in the winter issue, 2005, that's volume 41, is the second 5 characters that he references in his volume here, in which we asked him to present today. And I will give you just a fingernail sketch of a few of those eyewitnesses that he identifies. The first and most important, I think, is William Camden. William Camden was the foremost antiquary and biographer in England during the Elizabethan age. His volume, Britannia, which was published in Latin in the late 1580s and then reissued in 6 additional volumes as it expanded right up to his death in 1623. I've actually seen an early copy of Britannia that is at the Southern Oregon University Library.
I remember that.
Yeah, in the Bailey collection.
We held a summer seminar.
We did.
There,
we brought that out
last year or the year before.
That's right. And it's broken down into the various counties or shires of England, including Warwickshire. And the references in the text translated out of the Latin in the description of the town of Stratford upon Avon, and this is in 1609 edition of this wonderful collection, refers to only 2 characters being famous in Stratford. One, was Hugh Clopton, who was the future mayor of London, who built the Clopton Bridge over the River Avon. And John de Stratford, who became the Archbishop of Canterbury and helped build Holy Trinity Church in Stratford. He makes no mention whatsoever of a William Shakespeare, who was a famous poet and playwright of that era. Now, he does mention, of course, Michael Drayton, who lived in Warwickshire, or was from Warwickshire, a famous playwright and poet. And Drayton himself is a character who should have seen or commented on Will Shakespeare. Camden himself was a poet, and he wrote other volumes about poetry and poets of England. He mentioned Spenser and Drayton, of course, and Sidney and Shakespeare, but never mentions the fact that Shakespeare came from Stratford upon Avon. Now, Camden was also an officer in the College of Arms and reviewed the application of John Shakespeare's application in the late 1590s.
Okay, so that means that he absolutely knew who the Shakespeare family was, right?
He did, and yet He makes no mention of it in any of his published volumes or works of Will Shakespeare from Stratford-upon-Avon being the author of the Shakespeare canon. So, and he was connected to Ben Jonson.
Just an oversight, right?
Oh, no.
Just a oops,
Absolutely.
left that out by accident.
Now, there are some people that wonder about the Shakespeare motto, non sans droit, not without right. Now, there's two ways of interpreting that. Not without right, meaning we're entitled to this coat of arms, or no,
he couldn't
without right. and if you go to Stratford-upon-Avon on Henley Street at the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, they have the big symbol, non sans droit. It's a joke. It's probably a joke because there was a big controversy that occurred whether the Shakespeare family actually deserved the alteration in the coat of arms that they had applied for in the late 1590s. And Camden was in the middle of that discourse. So I think that for a variety of reasons, the absence of any commentary on Will Shakespeare as a great author, playwright, poet, whatever, from Stratford-upon-Avon is a gaping hole in the traditional biography.
You touch on something there, though, because think about this. If they knew that John Shakespeare and his son Will couldn't read and write,
no.
They could, especially not Latin, they could have created any motto for them and told them it meant anything, and they would have had no idea what it said.
That's true. On the other hand, it says the motto itself, non sans droit is one thing, but on several documents it says Shakespeare ye player. It doesn't say Shakespeare ye playwright, ye poet, ye writer. It says ye player. And we know he was a member of the Lord Chamberlain's men, so he was a player. But whether he was the author or not is highly questionable, given the absence of any suggestion that Camden acknowledged him as a writer.
So Camden is eyewitness number one.
He is eyewitness number one. And we mentioned Michael Drayton, who also wrote Paleo-Oblion, which is a narrative history of the great poets of England. And that was published in the early 17th century. And it makes no mention of Shakespeare as being from Stratford-upon-Avon or any reference to him at all. So Drayton, again, is another character that Ramon identifies as someone who should have noted that a fellow man from Warwickshire, and Drayton grew up about 30 miles or so from Stratford-upon-Avon, so he has other family connections that would have brought him into contact with Will Shakespeare. And one other thing that's interesting is William Shakespeare's son-in-law, Dr. John Hall, was a physician who took care of Michael Drayton. He talks about Drayton and Drayton as a poet. He talks about some of the other...
He was proud to have Drayton as a patient.
He absolutely was.
When you were a physician, if somebody, let's say a Keanu Reeves, I'll use him because he's a fellow Oxfordian, but let's say a Keanu Reeves walked into your emergency room and you treated him for something, wouldn't you have been proud to have been like, oh, I fixed Keanu Reeves' broken arm, or I stitched up a cut that he received on a movie set, or something of that nature? You would think that would be mentioned somewhere.
I would have violated every HIPAA law in the world, gotten my picture of Keanu Reeves on my gurney, and posted it on Facebook.
With a selfie?
With a selfie.
Yeah, absolutely.
No. I mean, Dr. John Hall moved to Stratford-upon-Avon in the early 17th century, and in 1607 married Susanna Shakespeare. And some people have suggested that, well, it was this conversation with John Hall that taught Shakespeare his outstanding medical knowledge. Regrettably, the most of the plays that have any kind of medical content were published long before John Hall was a resident of Stratford-upon-Avon. Now, he was a well-known physician in that region, highly respected, and published his personal notes were later published in translation. The notes were, of course, in Latin, but they were published in translation, and no reference, no mention, no comment at all on his father-in-law, who was, of course, the famous playwright. He does talk about Michael Drayton and other notable characters within Stratford, but never mentions his father-in-law as a famous playwright. He's writing these things in the early 17th century, long after Shakespeare's
I'm going to be
reputation.
the Stratfordian devil advocate here and say Camden, it was an oversight. Drayton was jealous and didn't want to reference Shakespeare, and Hall was humble and didn't want to bring great attention to his notorious father-in-law.
Oh, how brilliant of you, Stephen. I so appreciate
I think Stanley Wells would be proud of me right now.
Yes. Well, let's talk about another character that Ramon talks about, Thomas Green. Thomas Green was a solicitor for the Stratford-upon-Avon in London at the London court. And he was also the town clerk for over a decade in Stratford-upon-Avon. And in 1609 and 10, he was actually living in New Place with the Shakespeare family the year that they published Shakespeare's sonnets and the first two quartos of Troilus and Cressida. And does he ever mention Shakespeare in any of his notes, letters, writing, acknowledging his host who took care of him, housed him for many months during that period of time? Never once. And that's another point that Ramon makes. Ramon, like Catherine Chilgen, is an outstanding historian that look at the documents and say, how come the hound didn't bark? They're like Sherlock Holmes, wondering about why weren't there some personal references from these people who obviously knew the Shakespeare family, knew Will, and should have acknowledged him in some form in their writings, their published writings, their diaries, their letters, their poetry, something to that effect. But
I have never published a book. I have never really published anything. I have written some plays. And I know that quite a number of our illustrious members have published quite a number of books. Some of them we've talked about already throughout last night and today. And through knowing some of those people and through my own work in writing a play and preparing it for production, it's a busy time. It's a super busy time, and it really absorbs you, and it is the only thing you can really focus on. And many of our scholars who've been working on their publications, one of the most recent ones that comes to mind is Brian Wildenthal's book, and how detailed and busy he was involved in that. We're going to see a presentation from Brian later today about that book, but it's consuming. And so you're talking about a man who lived in the household of Shakespeare at a time when he should have been consumed with publishing his sonnets. Nothing. Not a peep.
No, the ever-living poet did not live on Henley Street. I'm sorry.
Apparently not.
Yeah.
Who's next on your list?
Okay, Phillip Henslow, who kept a detailed diary of productions that he put on at the Rose Theater during the 1590s. Okay, so he's a theater manager, and Henslow's diary is the source of so much of what we know about the Renaissance theater in England during that time.
Wonderfully portrayed by Geoffrey Rush.
That's it.
In the film Shakespeare in Love.
That's it.
Phillip Henslow.
Yeah. Well, he never once mentions the name Shakespeare in the entire diary collection. Not once does he mention him. He has the names of many other playwrights in there, and of course the names of many plays, including Shakespeare plays, appear in Henslow's diary. But there's no mention of the author Shakespeare or Shakespeare. Now, until 1598, none of the Shakespeare quartos bore his name. The ones that we came later to attribute to Shakespeare. Starting in 1598, corresponding with the death of Lord Burleigh, it seems, perhaps, the plays began to be published with the name Shakespeare or Shake-Spear in the quartos that were published after that. And in fact, there were several quartos published after 1598 that were also published anonymously. But since the name Shakespeare became kind of valuable, I think that was one of the things that became important. And then we get back to Michael Drayton. Michael Drayton is known to have co-authored the play Sir John Oldcastle, along with Anthony Munday and one or two other writers. So they co-authored this play that was published under the name by William Shakespeare. So Drayton is using Shakespeare's name, for a play that he co-authors with Anthony Munday, who was one of Earl of Oxford's secretaries back in the 1580s.
And just for folks who may be viewing who are thinking, well, Sir John Oldcastle, who is that? Well, what we know is that Sir John Oldcastle is the prototype character for Sir John Falstaff.
Right. So, I mean, that's another thing. So Henslow's diary, another document that provides lots of information about theater culture during the 1590s particularly, but makes no mention of the author Shakespeare, not even for his published poems, Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, which was published in 1593-94. So we have a big empty hole there also.
All right, so I'm counting now. Was that 5? What is that? Is that 6?
That's 5. We have one more I want to bring up here because I think he's a double dose. Edward Aline, the most famous actor of that period, kept copious diaries. He was Phillip Henslow's son-in-law. So he was part of that family, a theater investor, a man that made a pretty good profit on it all. Robert Greene did not think much of Edward Aline, and Greene's Groat's Worth of Wit, published in 1592, and Catherine Chilgen's discussion of this is perhaps the best you'll find, is commonly referenced by traditional Shakespeare scholarships as referencing Will Shakespeare, who had just recently arrived in London, the upstart crow,
Yes.
who could bombast out lines and this sort of thing. Well, far more likely, and Catherine nails this argument, and others, authors, Marlovians in particular, have been on this case, that the upstart crow is actually a reference to Edward Aline. Well, Edward Aline kept copious notebooks, diaries, and never once mentions Will Shakespeare, even though he was perhaps the most prominent and important actor during that period, and no question about perhaps was probably cast in several of Shakespeare's plays during the early part of his career.
So are you saying that perhaps Edward Aline was the target of Hamlet's criticism of actors when he says, saw not the air and use wild gestures? And perhaps here we have Edward de Vere also poking at Edward Aline through the character of Hamlet in the way that Thomas Green was stabbing at the same actor for being an actor as opposed to really living the roles and the characters.
I think that there's probably a great deal of truth in what you say, but you should read the chapter in Catherine Children's book on Green's Groves with the Wit. I think it would really put a very clear contrast to what traditional scholars would like you to think, that this is the first reference to Shakespeare appearing in London after the lost years in which we don't know what happened to him between the birth of his twins and when he finally turns up in London and becomes a member of the Lord Chamberlain's Men, for which there are some documentation in the 1590s for which he received payments and cloth and these kinds of things because he was a member of the company. So those are 6 of the 10 that Ramon Jimenez covers in that. So I would recommend you get Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, ? Exposing an Industry in Denial, published by the Shakespeare Authorship Coalition. In 2012, during our annual conference, John Shahan proposed that we put something like this together, like this, in a response to the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. So,
period.
It's the closest thing that we have to a monkey-wrenching operation in which we created a book. And I have to say, Tom Rainier's article on Shakespeare and the Law is there. Many other classical articles that are about the whole Shakespeare attribution. There's not a lot in there about Edward de Vere as the author, but it's all about the question of how did he know this? Where did he get that? Including my article about Shakespeare's medical knowledge. So I do recommend you get that book, Shakespeare Beyond Doubt, Exposing an Industry in Denial. If you're not familiar with those essays, and Ramon's classical essay on the 10 eyewitnesses is included in that. But I do want to think also that he's still working for us. His research going back 20 years is still very valuable to our argument. But the current issue of the Oxfordian, which has just been published a couple of weeks ago, is now available. And Ramon's extended article on the famous victories of Henry V, which encompasses the Prince Hal trilogy. So Henry IV, Part 1, Part 2, and Henry V are all based on the earlier play, The Famous Victories of Henry V, and Ramon does an extended argument about that in this issue of the Oxfordian. He also published a review in this issue, so there's a lot of great articles in this Oxfordian. If you're a member of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, you can purchase this. You can get a copy for $10 online at Amazon, print on demand. So I do recommend, so that you stay current with the most recent arguments and research that our preeminent historian Ramon Jimenez has given us in the current issue of the Oxfordian, edited by our illustrious editor, Gary Goldstein. A number of other articles, and articles from Sky Gilbert are in here. Reviews of several other books presented by our presenters over the Symposium are also included in this issue of the Oxfordian. So I do promote that as well. I think it's well worth your investment.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, something very near and dear to my heart. My most recent Shakespearean production was Henry IV, Parts 1 and 2, combined into one night of theater. And I had the privilege of playing King Henry. My Prince Hal was the grandson of the great actor Hal Holbrook. The young Will Holbrook played Prince Hal to my Henry. We had a wonderful time working together on that show. And definitely worth the read when you pick up the Oxfordian. 22. That in itself is a magnificent thing too. 22 issues of the Oxfordian now that our organization has been able to produce and publish. And that is just another one of the programs that the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship is involved in year after year, and another way that your contributions to the organization are put to use. And so we thank you all for who have contributed to the organization and who will continue to contribute to the organization so we can keep doing that. You know, Earl, I remember back in 2012, that conference was in Pasadena.
It was.
And it was a post-day of programming dinner that was held at a restaurant there in Pasadena, right, where yourself and Roger Strittmatter and John Shahan and all the usual suspects were all gathered together. And I was very new to the organization at that time and just pleased to be in the room when that conversation happened and the plan to produce this book came to be. And it was a proud moment for me as an Oxfordian to be there and to be able to help contribute to the discussion with regards to what the PR and marketing aspect would be to counter the book that they had put out to try to just stifle this question. And I love the giant question mark. And if you can't see that image, I know our producer hates it when we hold stuff up to the camera, but here you go. But yeah, a wonderful moment in the history of the organization was the planning to create this fabulous book.
And in a matter of months, this whole production came together. Thank you to Alexander Waugh and John Shahan for co-editing this and producing this. There's a whole series of essays in there that are truly outstanding. One other thing that you've mentioned in passing during this conversation this afternoon is the question of dating of Shakespeare plays. And I would refer viewers to go to the Google and Google Dating Shakespeare's Plays UK, and you'll be delivered to Kevin Gilveri's wonderful website that's now freely available. The book itself is out of print, so we can't get that. But the entire collection of essays that covers all the plays of Shakespeare are there. And Kevin's essay on the criteria by which the plays are dated is very, very worthwhile reading. There's great uncertainty about when these plays were actually written, let alone when they were first published, and let alone, some of them were registered and then blocked from publication for 5, 6, 7 years longer, perhaps permanently. And you get a good idea of the complexity of the decisions around dating Shakespeare's plays. It's foundational to the whole Oxford enterprise. We have references to Hamlet from 1589, and yet the first quarter wasn't published in 1603. So traditional scholars are saying Shakespeare wrote that around 1600, but there are at least 5 or 6 references to Hamlet productions, and some of them that are combined with a playbill that included Titus Andronicus and Taming of a Shrew. So an early version of Taming of the Shrew plus Titus Andronicus plus an early version of Hamlet performed at the Bull in 1594. So, how
old was Shakespeare in 1594?
Oh, he was 30, was he? Yeah. 64 to 94, he's 30 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Okay. However it takes. But the dating of the plays is a critical issue. And Catherine certainly struck a chord talking about the evidence that The Tempest was actually written perhaps as long as 20 years before it's acknowledged or thought to have been written, because we do have documentation of court performances in 1611 and 1613. But when it was actually written was probably very, very, very much earlier.
You touch on something really interesting there, because it makes me suddenly think, because you talked about how some of these plays were written or they're mentioned or they were performed, but they were blocked from being published.
Right.
And it almost makes you wonder if the Earl of Oxford writes this play with this title, it gets performed, it is disliked by the censors of the day, most likely William Cecil, Lord Burleigh. And so, as clever as he is, he goes, you know what? I'm just going to present the exact same play with a new title to try to sneak it under the radar. That's a possibility, don't you think?
All is true.
All is true. Like maybe Taming of a Shrew was, not well received, so he changed it to Taming of the Shrew to try to pass it off as a different play or a new play.
Troilus and Cressida has 3 different titles. There's a tragical history of Troilus and Cressida. There's a famous tragedy of Troilus and Cressida. There's the comedy of Troilus and Cressida. Which do you choose? And the 2 quartos have absolutely contradictory statements. One says, whoa, is performed by the Lord Chamberlain's men many times. In other words, has never previously performed, never clapped or clawed by by an audience.
That would lend some credence to my new theory that he was trying to sneak them in wherever he could. One of the most famous ones that theater artists we talk about all the time is Twelfth Night is a very popular comedy, and many actors almost every actress I know wants to play Viola in Twelfth Night someday. Many of the most comic actors I know love to get their hands on Feste, although I think Malvolio is the much funnier role in the play. But a lot of people don't even know that play is actually titled What You Will.
What You Will.
So here you have a play that is very well known, that has two titles that are two accepted titles for the same play, but perhaps it was about trying to misidentify the play so he could sneak it past censors. The other aspect I think that's interesting about what we've been discussing is in Ramon's research, so many of our researchers look for the evidence that is there. And what Ramon has discovered with the 10 eyewitnesses who saw nothing is the evidence in what is not there.
That's true.
And I think that's a wonderful line to follow with regards to study and research into this topic, because there's a lot more that isn't there that should be in a lot of other places. And we commonly talk about the absence of Shakespeare having any kind of letters or memos or journals, the absence of him owning any books or having any sort of library. And I think those giant gaping holes are also evidence, even though there's nothing there.
Nothing but that second best bed.
And
for a playwright that praises beautiful, intelligent women. I mean, all the women that shine throughout the canon, I don't even pretend to start naming them, from a playwright whose daughters were functionally illiterate. So it challenges my heart. It's one of the fundamental historical features that raised the doubts most seriously in my mind. How can a man that would praise such wonderful female characters, such powerful female characters, have allowed his daughters to not even be able to appreciate his plays in a printed text? So I have, that is one of the quintessential things. His daughter Judith signed with a mark. And if you look at Shakespeare's signatures, the 6 signatures that we have, which are featured, of course, there's a whole article about Shakespeare's signatures and comparing his signatures to those of other playwrights that are contemporaneous with him, suggests that his secretary hand was barely legible and that he was not a writer. Now, maybe he had a secretary to which he could dictate his plays, but we have no evidence that was the case.
No, absolutely. And, as a father of 2 young girls, and I have written a couple of plays, but I'm nowhere near a Shakespeare by any means. But as a man of the theater, I have already shared my art and my craft with my children. I have already introduced them to some of the female characters of the Shakespearean canon because they are so inspiring. My eldest daughter Stella already knows that famous line from The Merchant of Venice. The quality of mercy is not. Ooh, and apparently Caesar, the dog, is familiar with that one too. But the quality of mercy is not strained. And that you'd say that to my daughter, and she knows immediately you're talking about The Merchant of Venice. She has already performed in her first Shakespeare play. She played the little Indian boy in the last production of A Midsummer Night's Dream that I produced a couple summers ago. And my younger daughter, Sienna, spelled with one N after the city in Italy, Oxford's favorite Italian city. Right now, my wife and I are working on a production of Shaw's Pygmalion, and my little daughter Sienna will run around and say, "There's your slippers, and may you never have a day's luck with them," already mimicking mommy learning her lines to play Eliza Doolittle. And the idea that is happening already in my household with daughters 6 and 3, and the thought that this guy couldn't share any of that with his daughters, or didn't, or refused to, or P.S. maybe couldn't because it wasn't his work and it wasn't his life, certainly makes a lot more sense to me. And again, there's those big gaping holes that I think are also evidence in our argument.
You mentioned Siena, and I have to just divert a little bit here. We do know that the Earl of Oxford visited Siena during his year in Italy. and that he would have visited the Sienese Cathedral, which is a remarkable cathedral. And that is where the Seven Ages of Man mosaic exists in the floor of that theater, which of course is a part of the, As You Like It, that Jacques describes this
yes.
as the Seven Ages of Man, that exactly fits with the descriptions that are in the mosaic itself. So that is a remarkable topical allusion that is you've brought up inadvertently, Stephen. Thank you very much for mentioning.
That's my job. That's what I do. Those of you who pay attention to the podcast, you know that my job as the host of the podcast series is basically just to throw out these crazy ideas and let the real experts and real scholars expound upon them and deliver the details that I myself am still just a true student of, like many of you who are joining us today. And we hope that throughout last evening's performance and presentations, performance. See, there's the theater guy in me. And today's presentations, we hope that the ongoing theme has been to continue to spark interest in this great mystery and to lead you to your own research and your own study and to present to you the resources that we have available and that the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship has compiled to present and prepared to make available to you so that you can find your truth in all of this. One of the things that you find, Earl, that's very true, just in some of the presenters that we've seen today, right. Yes, we're Oxfordians, but some of us believe differently about why Oxford used a pseudonym. Some of us believe differently about the dating of the plays. Right. I don't particularly believe that Titus Andronicus was as early a play as a lot of people believe. I think it shows much more masterful writing. Other people call it more juvenilia. We have differences. We all have different thought patterns that we follow, as Mark Alexander pointed out earlier today. We all have our blind spots that we have to overcome. But the one thing we do share, that we all share, and I hope that all of you who are viewing right now and listening in also share, is a love for this literature.
Absolutely. And what is available today, as opposed to what was available just 10 years ago, for this research, for books that are being published, for what's available online, is a phenomenal leap forward. So please go viral with this. Tell your friends. Give them a book. Buy Shakespeare Beyond Doubt. It's a wonderful way of introducing people to this whole argument. And I would say that since 2005, when we began having our conferences as in the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship group, we've made great progress. And our website is a wonderful resource for people. There are other websites that you can link to out of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website that give you, like Mark Alexander's source text website, has all these original PDFs of documents and literature from that era. And it's like going down the rabbit hole, friends. You can have a great time. But what it does is when you go to the theater, then when you pick up the text of the plays and the poems, you have a deeper understanding of the author's intention, of the author's life, of the connection between literature and life. And this is what makes it magical, where you make an original discovery on your own. It's entirely possible with literature that's now 400 years old, and still new discoveries are being made all the time.
Every day. And our wonderful members are constantly out there putting all of that research together, creating it, putting it in a place where people can access it freely on our website. You don't have to be a member in order to go to the website and get that information. And one thing I'll say right now, especially, it's not a secret to everybody that we're in a very political landscape right now. If you've grown tired of the squabbling and the backbiting and the fighting and arguing and finger pointing that's going on in the political spectrum right now, jump into this fray instead. Get your friends away from the big political debate and get them into this debate. Send them to our Facebook page. Share our Facebook page in a post on your social media and say, hey, I discovered this. You could do it very innocently. Oh, look what I discovered. Don't you think that's interesting? And get a conversation going. Change the dynamic. If you're just so sick of what some social media platforms have become, you can direct the conversation to something completely new, completely different, that people get just as passionate about, I will warn you, but in the grand scheme of things, is far more entertaining and much more interesting than some of the stuff that's going on these days. So yeah, make a post, find one of the memes from our Facebook page and share it to your friends or to your own page, and maybe just ask the question, hey, what do you think about this? Isn't this interesting? I found this website. I'm looking into this new topic. I've discovered this mystery. Here's something my Shakespeare professor never taught me. Here's something they never showed me in English class. What do you all think? Is anyone aware of this? Have you seen it? Begin the conversation. You never know what you might find. You might form your own little Shakespeare authorship group in your own little community to discuss these things and share this information with each other and talk about your own theories about why it may or may not have been Oxford, why it could or could not have been Shakespeare of Stratford, whether or not you believe in the Prince Tudor theory, whether or not you believe in the pseudonyms of the time. These are the discussions that we're having all the time as Oxfordians to try to get to the truth. And all ideas, all thoughts are welcome in this argument, and because we're all seeking the same thing. We want to know what the real answer is to this mystery because we love these works so much.
Thank you, Stephen. That's a beautiful thought.
Yeah, let's not squabble about politics. Let's squabble about Shakespeare. What do you think?
I think it's time.
All right. I don't know how, I didn't pay attention to our clock. Normally when we're doing a podcast recording, we've got our microphones right here in our faces. We've got our earphones on. We're in a quiet little room to keep sound out. We're paying attention to the timer on the recording device to make sure that we wrap up right around an hour. Most of our podcast episodes are right around an hour. And again, if you haven't listened in to some of the podcasts, the style and the flavor of them is very much like this. We sit, we have a discussion, we have a conversation about a topic or about a book or about some research, and it's very informal and we share ideas. And it's something that you can easily listen to on your commute to and from work. I know folks who like to put on their headphones while they're doing their morning jog or working out at their local gym. Some folks have radios, those waterproof radios that hang in the shower, and they're listening to podcast episodes in the shower. Podcasts are becoming one of the great mediums of sharing information right now. And if you are an avid listener of the series, please consider supporting the series by going to dragonwagonradio.com. You'll find a bunch of other really good podcasts there as well on that network. We're just one of the series on the network. And you'll also find the Don't Quill the Messenger swag page, which normally I would be wearing my Don't Quill the Messenger shirt, except I wanted to have a collar for today's presentation. But you can get a Don't Quill the Messenger shirt, coffee mug, water jug, a variety of different things. And I tell you, every time I wear my shirt, wherever I go, somebody asks me about it, somebody wants to know more, and it really opens the door to the conversation. I whip out a little card about the podcast series and say, listen in, see what you can learn. And keep asking questions.
One more point, friends. A call out to Jake Lloyd, our producer here for the Symposium, who's also the producer for the Don't Quill the Messenger podcast series.
Oh, I'm ashamed for being remiss. Jake. Yes, thank you to Jake Lloyd. He puts every podcast episode together. He designs our wonderful graphics for each of the episodes. He makes sure that they get uploaded to, 90 different podcast streaming sites. I can't keep track of them all. I know that you, if you're a podcast listener, you have your favorite, whether it's Apple iTunes or Crusher, Thresher, Trasher. What are those? There's one that's called something like that. But whatever your favorite one is, if there is a rate and review, we would love for you to do that. We'd love you to rate the podcast, give us a review. It drives us up the rankings so that other people can find it and we can grow that listenership. And if you haven't been a follower of our Facebook page, go and click like, go click follow. Share a meme or two. That's going to be one of the things I'm going to be working on soon, is creating a meme contest for our social media platforms. So if you've got some ideas on how to share the message in a clever, cute, memeful way, get it memeful way, send me something. You can find me right on the webpage. If you go to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship website and you go to the publicity page, you'll find my email there, publicity@ShakespeareOxfordFellowship.org, publicity@shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. Send me an email. Love to hear from you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
All right. We'll be back in a minute.